Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 45th week of 2017. I'm Carl Estabrook. For more than a quarter century, this program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Our program's name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who's been writing sensible things about U.S. politics for half a century. Chomsky says that in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and will sound like it's from Neptune. Tonight, David Green and I, at News from Neptune, will try to say some true things. With thanks to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, for research. No's notes are posted on the blog, newsfromneptune.com. And bearing in mind Rosa Luxemburg's remark, the most revolutionary thing you can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. And George Orwell's observation in the suppressed premise of Animal Farm, that if liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. This is a Often Poets Get There First edition, and that line, which we've mentioned here before, came to me particularly this week because for my sins I attended a meeting at the little university around the corner, sponsored by the Klein Center for Advanced Social Research, a propaganda shop masquerading as scholarship, staffed by tame academics and paid for by the 1%. They sponsored a discussion, a symposium, they said, and a lecture under the title Debating America's Grand Strategic Alternatives. And as these things must have, they had a provocative top title for it that included the phrase big stick. No Freudian references, I think, are meant. They're talking about Teddy Roosevelt's advice to walk softly and carry a big stick as a description for American foreign policy. As I said, it was a penance on my part to attend. The description of the meeting was 5 participants with more than a half-century of combined military and diplomatic experience. You might want to jazz with that one too.
That's only 10 years each. That doesn't sound like much.
Well, they were all 15 years old. So
okay, I see.
Hailing, they say, from the College of Law, the Departments of Political Science and Military Science. I discovered this week something I'd never known, and it was Clemenceau who originally said that you destroy the meaning of any word by putting the word military in front of it, that military music is to music, consider, he said, military music, military intelligence, and so forth falls into the same pattern.
You might want to explain who Clemenceau was.
The French leader in the First World War.
And not known for his sense of humor.
Exactly. I can't even get his line quite right, so I'll straighten that out and post it. It is amusing. Now, the announced topic of this symposium yesterday was, and I quote, "Can diplomatic cooperation or international law succeed where force fails?" The implied answer, of course, was no, and grand strategy, which is the use of force in international affairs, was therefore the topic of the day. As I listened to it, I imagine listening to a group of German academics and apparatchiki discussing grand strategy, say in the autumn of 1939. The parallel would be the invasion of Iraq and the invasion of Poland. You can imagine what the German academics would have said in the fall of 1939 about the successful invasion of Poland, and that's what our friends at the university had to say about the successful invasion of Iraq. The whole program was based on the premise that the greatest international crime so far of the 21st century was in fact a good thing, capital G, capital T, and we just had to find the right way to take advantage of it. We being, of course, the United States government. The only moment of levity in the whole enterprise was provided by our ex-radio partner, Paul Muth, who broke in when one of these sages observed that we really didn't follow up enough on the opportunity provided by 9/11. We should have used the opportunity to attack, to invade the region from which bad stuff comes, that is the region between Afghanistan and Pakistan, and our failure to put American troops in the region between Afghanistan and Pakistan was a terrible mistake. Brother Muth could not hold his peace, as it were, at that point.
Good for him.
And exactly. And it had to be shushed by the moderator for speaking out of turn. Good for Paul.
We'll give him his news from Neptune merit badge for that performance.
I'd be happy to do that.
Yeah.
I have to admit, I didn't stay to hear the questions except for Paul's. The first question in the question period was, and I quote, "What's the business community's responsibility to U.S. grand strategy?" Now, that did not lead to the sort of discussion that we've had here frequently about the relationship between neoliberalism and neoconservatism, I'm sure, but I didn't stay to find out.
But I can certainly follow up on that in my comments.
Good. I did find, as my fantasy suggests, I did find myself imagining what the session would be like had Germany won World War II, and we were hearing today about German grand strategy. And that's not quite so far-fetched as we sometimes think. As I say, the poets often get there first. There have been a number of recent literary, poetical attempts to think about that. Suppose these were successful German politicians and academics talking about post-war German grand strategy in a world in which Germany had won the war. The classic example of this is Philip K. Dick's novel, The Man in the High Castle, from the early 60s, which has recently been turned into an HBO series, which I haven't seen, but takes up this notion of a German-Japanese victory in World War II and the politics some 15 years after the end of that war. Another one from a few years later is Len Deighton's SSGB. SSGB stands for Schutzstaffel Great Britain. That is the SS organization that would be running Great Britain had Germany won the war in Europe. Deighton is a good novelist, and he has interesting political observations to make on that sort of world. And both of these novels give us a remarkable basis for comparison to what we're actually living through now.
It would have saved us Margaret Thatcher.
Beg pardon?
It would have saved us Margaret Thatcher.
No, I think she would have done very well under that regime.
You have a good point.
Exactly.
You have a good point.
The two other books that turned up as I mused on these subjects, one that I've mentioned here before and I think is absolutely indispensable for anybody who wants to know about contemporary politics, is called Human Smoke: The Beginnings of World War II and the End of Civilization. That was written, it's not a novel, although it's written by a novelist. It's an historical work, a remarkable historical work by Nicholson Baker about the coming of World War II. The book questions the commonly held belief that the Allies, that is, the Allies are always us, right, the U.S. and Britain, wanted to avoid the war at all course, but were forced into action by the Germans. Nonsense, says Baker. Look at the historical record. It becomes clear who wanted the war, the U.S. and the U.K. Another political writer has made the same point in an interesting piece of work. Patrick Buchanan, who is normally dismissed as a right-winger, but is in fact a paleo-conservative, wrote almost a decade ago now a book entitled Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War, How Britain Lost Its Empire and the West Lost the World, close quote. It's a good book. Buchanan knows what he's talking about, and he, as I say, challenges, the same way the novelists do, our easy assumptions about the truth, beauty, and American way that prevailed in the Second World War. It's worth talking about when we have academics filling up our classrooms with reflections on American grand strategy, which turns out about whom should we attack next. We'll come back to this, I'm sure. You're watching News from Neptune, and we'll go to David Green for a laundry list of the week's sins, offenses, and neglects.
I feel better now that I've got my red-brown shirt on. That's referring to this controversy over the alliances between the so-called left and the so-called right, referred to as the red-brown, red being for the communists especially, and I guess brown being for fascists. Mussolini. I don't know whether
That's not the reason for the hat. That's an accident, really.
Yeah. So so I get we have the sartorial theme going here as well as the whole Buchanan and et cetera.
We'll have to talk to the costuming department for this program.
Yeah, we don't plan these things though, which makes it all the much more fun. But to segue from your U of I critique, your implied critique of the U of I and academia and the way they handle these things, had a letter in the paper this morning.
Indeed, you did.
Which was also a critique of the U of I, more from the neoliberal than neoconservative perspective that you were just referring to. And I think it's important. I rewrote that letter a couple of times. I actually had sent one in and then wasn't happy with it and then revised it. And I'm not quite sure that I got it the way I wanted to, but what I'm trying to get at here, I think I could explain more clearly, is that in the context of someone like Noam Chomsky, who worked at MIT for all those years, who perfectly well understood that his research in symbolic logic and languages and computational linguistics and all the kind of stuff that he became famous for before he was famous for his political work, that was all being funded by the Pentagon. And of course, for years, he's talked about that. He's talked about the purpose of Pentagon funding, and he's talked about the manner in which technology developed by public money is then appropriated in the private sector, of course, for private profit. And of course, he could probably, some people actually have criticized him for taking Pentagon money, but he's always explained that in terms of the importance of basic research and it perhaps in terms of his own dissidence in response to U.S. foreign policies, which would be worth a lot more than him quitting his job at MIT and not doing his scientific work. But we could talk about that, but that's sort of in the context of understanding when the U of I, day after day, it's $1 billion here, $1 billion there. First, they're going to spend the $1.2 billion on this high-tech corridor, which relates the U of I to Chicago. Then there's another couple of 20, 30 million for some other project. Then there's Governor Rauner and President Khalil going over to Israel and cutting some deals there for research. And then in the paper this morning, not exactly research related, but we've got another $1.2 billion. $1.2 billion seems the magic number to renovate this campus. And the question, and certainly there's a lot of things that need to be fixed up on this campus, and it's a grand scheme, and I'm sure that a lot of people are saying, well, this must be good. Isn't this great? What things will be, 10 years from now when things are all done, we raise our $2.5 billion and we spend part of that on this campus and this and that. Won't things be better? Won't things be better after all these research opportunities in the high-tech corridor take place and the venture capitalists? I was about to say vulture capitalists, but it's sort of the same
Part of
thing.
that too.
Partly the same thing. Won't they develop some stuff that'll make our lives better? And certainly most people, myself included, understand our lives to be better because of progress in technology, high tech computers, even obviously what we're sitting here doing. But the question that has to be asked, which I raised 2 or 3 weeks ago on this program, which I'm going to apparently keep having to raise, and as long as they keep talking about how wonderful the world is going to be, how good all this is why does society keep getting worse? Why does the economic plight of so many people keep being worse? It's implied in this so-called progress that everybody's going to benefit, that this is still a public university, and somehow everybody's going to benefit from elites doing these things and sort of trickle down. It's not really trickled down in terms of the way it was talked about in terms of Ronald Reagan, but it's trickled down like the stuff that gets developed is going to trickle down, and pretty soon we're all using a cell phone or a smartphone, and pretty soon we're doing this and that. And it just doesn't seem to work that way. As I pointed out in my letter, it's like we've got a pretty severe social crisis on our hand, and including all of our wars. And what role does academia play in that? Well, if you're just a basic researcher who understands the role that people like Chomsky have played and all kinds of people, well, I just want to do my basic research, and I want to preferably get it funded by the National Institute for Science or for Health or whatever. What's wrong with that? And of course, there's nothing wrong with that. Yeah.
I'm just going to say there's been an interesting change from those days, though. I mean, I remember kicking around MIT and environs all those years ago during the Vietnam War, and there was serious demonstrations against weapons research that MIT was carrying on. MIT was very careful to say, the MIT administration, say they didn't carry on any weapons research on campus at all. And that was true because they had carefully removed all the weapons research to another place off campus. Now, the interesting thing is that call it what you will, excuse has given way right now. Universities like MIT no longer have to have the fig leaf of saying, well, we're not doing this on campus, including this one. And so it suggests the extent to which, the attempt by the American government and the political establishment to reverse and recoup the objections that grew out of the Vietnam War, including objections to what universities did, have been remarkably successful. They were remarkably successful in the years after the Vietnam War, but by the 1990s, they really had triumphed across the board. The American populace support for war research, and for grand strategy, as our academic polywogs engaged in yesterday, that was in place. That was put back in place. And this in a country in which, in 1970, 3/4 of the population thought the war in Vietnam was a crime. Not just that it was a mistake or a blunder or something of that sort, as these gentlemen and one female would have said yesterday on this panel. The overwhelming view in America in 1970 was that the Vietnam War was a crime, and a major effort of the American political establishment and government since those long ago days is to reverse that view among the American populace, and they've essentially succeeded.
What's hard for me to explain in a 250-word letter is the idea that technological progress is all well and good outside of the weaponry area, but in many areas. But that in this social context, especially in the way that venture capitalists, in terms of one of these projects, is supposed to invest in research, it's called rent seeking. It's the idea that you get a product and then you profit from it. And that's one way of describing the way neoliberalism has worked in this country in terms of taking basic research and turning it into profit. And that just serves to increase economic inequality and debt and all that kind of stuff. So, it isn't that researchers are guilty of anything other than not understanding the context in which research takes place in this neoliberal context, in which its policy. Dean Baker is always pounding on this point about the argument that economic inequality increases because we need smarter people to develop technology, and we need to pay them more. So if you haven't gotten yourself educated enough, well, too bad. But these are the people that are making our society better and your life better. And what Dean Baker and others, I'm sure, are always talking about is that technology is different from technology policy. The political policies and social policies in which these so-called advances play out tend to make the few rich much richer, and leave at least 50% of the population out of the real benefits of they can have their smartphone fine, but their lives haven't gotten better, and privileged people among say the top 10%, which is what academics are. They need to be more conscious of that. They don't have to be, they don't have to be defensive about, well, what am I doing wrong? Are you saying that I'm not behaving in a moral way? Well, if you're not, in a sense related to war as well as this, if you're not aware of what's going on and you're not opposing what's going on, then you're part of the problem. Sorry to bring back the 1960s again. You're part of the problem, and
they haven't gone away.
And yeah, it hasn't gone away. And there's a certain perhaps understandable, but still not laudable complacency among people who are just sort of doing well and having their good privileged lives and engaging in research projects that please them and that exercise their intellectual curiosity and all that good stuff. But it's not good enough when the culture's falling apart, as I explained in my letter.
Somebody asked me this week for the shortest possible description of neoliberalism. What did I mean in 2 or 3 words when I said neoliberalism? And the best I could come up with was unregulated capitalism. What neoliberalism was when it began as a conscious program by American business in the wake of the Vietnam War in the 1970s, what it meant was to roll back those social criticisms of the use of money and the use of and the actions of the very rich as they existed in the years after the Vietnam War. Those criticisms arose from an indication, from an understanding of whose interest the Vietnam War was being conducted in. Neoliberalism was an attempt to try to say, look, we've got the money, we're going to use it for what we want, and stop trying to pass laws that take the edge off what we do, everything from Social Security to support for unions to things like that. Deregulated capitalism became the watchword of American liberalism, neoliberalism, and it was the enthusiasm for the expansion of the free market that characterized neoliberalism. Deregulated capitalism, that's what we're dealing with. The interesting point is, in some ways, is its relationship to neoconservatism, the use of American military force. That was, in fact, what was being talked about in this program yesterday, a program sponsored by the very forces that have, by various interests that have profited from the reign of neoliberalism in the last 40 years. Neoliberalism and neoconservatism as deregulated capitalism and, as it were, deregulated militarism go together.
Yeah, I would only, my caveat to that would be that it's a specific form of deregulation that characterizes it. It doesn't, it's not, obviously the government bailed out the banks when we had the crisis in 2008, but even more, at a more fundamental level than that, neoliberalism, you know, when we talk about rent seeking, when we talk about all this research, we're talking about patents. We're talking about intellectual property rights. It's a highly regulated way of producing products and seeing that who profits from them. And you can question that in lots of ways. People just assume that, well, how are people going to invent stuff if they're not able to get patents for it? But again, Dean Baker, especially related to pharmaceutical research and whether it should be done privately or we should have basic public research and how that plays out and who profits from that, or whether there need to be profits at all involved in that. Those are important questions that still have to do with the regulatory state. And I think David Graeber, the anthropologist, has talked about that a lot, and about what regulation and deregulation actually means in various contexts. And of course, the bottom line, one other way of defining neoliberalism is the rich always win. The rich always get richer.
Exactly.
And they do it whether they don't care whether they have to regulate or deregulate to get richer. They don't care whether they have to fight more wars or fewer wars, as long as they're getting richer. But that's the government is still there, and the state is still there, and so the manner in which the corporate state has always worked historically in this country needs to be put in that context.
I'm always astonished at how few people seem to realize what's happened in recent American history in regard to economic equality. The notion is America is the land of opportunity, so forth and so on. If you work hard, you can do well and get rich, and so forth and so on. After all, don't we have a couple of centuries of indication that, well, for people, forgive me, my age, they've seen quite a remarkable change in this time. Inequality, economic inequality, access to wealth reached a height before the Great Depression. At the time of the stock market crash in 1929, that was the herald of the Great Depression of the 30s, the U.S. was as unequal probably as it had ever been. There's some argument about that, about the state of 19th century economics, but it was a remarkably unequal society. There are a few very rich, many very poor, and a middle class that was supposedly taking advantage of the opportunities to get rich, but weren't. The Great Depression and the government response to that, generally summarized under the phrase the New Deal, actually turned that around, and equality, or to put it another way, inequality, economic inequality in America declined from the 1930s through the 1960s. Neoliberalism was invented to reverse it, to increase inequality, and it succeeded beyond the wildest dreams, perhaps, of those 1970s businessmen who said this democracy stuff is getting out of hand. Since the 1970s to the present, wages in the United States have been essentially flat. Inequality has developed at a tremendous rate. We are a much more unequal society in terms of access to resources, in terms of money, a much more unequal society now than we were in the 1960s. as I say, I'm old enough to have seen it happen, and it's quite astonishing. I think you pointed out, David, in your letter that the 90% or more of the gains in wealth since the 2008 recession have gone to the top 1%. The inequality has increased over the last generation and increased at an accelerating rate. Not only are we more unequal, we're getting more unequal faster. And that continues. And those fundamental notions of inequality, by the way, the economic inequality, that's what elected Donald Trump. Those Americans in what we call somewhat inaccurately the middle class in this country saw their life chances and their economic circumstances decline through the Bush and Obama administrations at an accelerating rate over how they declined in the administrations before that. Finally, enough of those people said, this isn't worth it. I'm going to stay home and not vote for the pro-war, pro-Wall Street candidate, Hillary Clinton, and let this man with the funny hair perhaps have a chance to make America great again, in the sense of restoring those life chances and that reduction of inequality that characterized my parents' generation.
Yeah, well, there's a lot to say about that, and we've talked about it in the show, and the data that I quoted in the my 250-word limit was that the top 10% has gotten all of the gains in all the real economic gains in GDP since 1980.
Better than I did, yes.
Right, but and that the overall thing, which is the Piketty, Say's, Zuckerman data that we've talked about before, is that the 0.1% has 20% of the wealth, and the bottom 90% has another 20% of the wealth. So equal amounts of wealth between 1 out of 1,000 people and 900 out of 1,000 people is one way of looking at it.
Did you see the numbers this week that Jeff Bezos runs Amazon, Warren Buffett, and Bill Gates, the three of them together, those three people control as much wealth as the bottom half of the American population, as 150 million people. 160 probably in the bottom half of the American population. Three guys versus 160 million.
And
that's inequality for you. We don't mess around when it comes to inequality. We do it seriously.
It's not surprising at all if you just look at anything about poverty and debt. I mean, out of those 150 million people, basically at least half, and probably more than half, have no wealth.
Exactly.
They're
That's right.
They may own a home and have some equity in a home, but have debts that match that or equal that. But even the rest of those other 75 million people, well, they have a few $1,000s each, and their money. I'm not sure how they always count wealth, but I'm pretty sure they include like pensions. And when you're a regular person, you can say that you've got $100,000 in your retirement, but that's not the same as Bill Gates having $100,000. Okay, you've got that $100,000 so that when you get to be 65 or 70, you can cash that in and get a few $100s per month. Not so you could live, not that you can spend that wealth, so to speak. So. It's a rigged system. What can you say?
You're watching news from Neptune, and the system is indeed rigged.
I only got through one on my laundry list here, so can I go to number 2, or did you want to?
Why don't you go to number 2? I wanted to talk about China at some point today.
Okay, well, let me just get through a couple of points. It'll take 5 minutes. I've been. These are. Let me just talk about one thing, and maybe this will. There was a counterpunch article by the former Green Party vice presidential candidate Ajamu Baraka a couple of days ago, in which he informed me of the existence of a woman named Julia Ioffe, Ioffe, I assume Ioffe, I assume that's the way to pronounce her last name. She has become a writer. She is a 35-year-old Russian Jewish immigrant, came to this country when she was 7 years old and ended up at Princeton. And because she's obviously got a lot of creds, she ends up writing for some mainstream sort of liberal political magazines. She ends up at the Atlantic, and she wrote an article which Baraka was extremely critical of, called "The History of Russia's Involvement in America's Race Wars." This is a recent article from late last month, and the subtitle of this article was "From Propaganda Posters to Facebook Ads, 80-plus years of Russian meddling." That is, again, in America's race wars. Just the expression "race wars," that a liberal journal like what the Atlantic, which is, by liberal I mean neoliberal and neoconservative.
Exactly.
Okay, that's what I mean, of the Democratic Party ilk more than the Republican Party ilk.
But it's nice to know the Russian racism is the result of the Russians' activity, not anything we've done ourselves, right?
Yeah, and this understandably got Baraka's ire up, and what gets my ire up more than that is that a young woman, just because she's got some Russian Jewish cred, could come to this country at the age of 7 and be seen as having this kind of cred to talk about these things. This is what goes on. Is Masha Gessen at the New York Times and the whole thing. There's a pretty clear pattern here of who gets to talk about these things and who gets to be accorded some alleged credibility about these things. And it's just the idea that we're talking about the history of the civil rights movement and racial, even the term race wars is a pretty offensive way of talking about the history of race in this country, don't you think? I mean, it's wars, but who's got the army? I mean, who declared war on whom? Who's got the army? How has this war been fought? Yes, it's a kind of war, but
and indeed, the football protests that have metastasized across the country. Really have to do at first with the race wars. Colin Kaepernick, who started those demonstrations, said he was doing it for blacks killed by police in America. And that's what scared the establishment as much as it did when other football players began taking this up. So maybe the term race wars is defensible. The implications that she adds to the term, probably not.
Yeah. And one more thing, since I planned to sort of mention this in the context of of what we were talking about, you referred to the war, the foreign policy aspect of these things. We previously talked about this Internet of Things. That's another one of the. That's actually a pretty small project, money-wise. This Internet of Battlefield Things that a couple of our local professors were so proud of, and that the News Gazette was so proud of. That's actually only about $25 million as a part of a national consortium with several related prestigious institutions of higher education. But that needs to be thrown in terms of our understanding of your reference to the fact that they don't have to hide anymore the weapons research. They're talking about.
That's the change.
I know I mentioned this on a program a couple weeks back, but it's like these guys are proud of the fact that they can figure out how to use technology to kill people without direct human involvement, or at least without risk to American human life. Okay, even though they assured us, one of these professors assured us in this article that every decision would be human-made, and in other words, some human would have to judge whether somebody gets killed.
In other words, the robots won't get out of hand.
And implying that we will only kill guilty people.
Exactly.
Which, of course, is never the case in these wars. So I needed to get that off my chest.
50 years ago, there would have been an outcry on American campuses about this. Today, there isn't. And that's no accident.
And so just to bring it a little bit full circle, you mentioned MIT and the fact, and also the protests, and at the same time, there was a lot going on for instance, at Stanford, in reference to Dow Chemical and the research that was going on in there. H. Bruce Franklin is the person most identified with that, and so you've got, and again, that's related to this. I think that a couple of the consortium on this Internet of Battlefield things were West Coast. Stanford might have been one of them. So that's how far we've not come, or that's how far we've come backwards to the bad old days.
Other things on your list?
Why don't you go ahead, and then I'll see.
I wanted to call our attention to 2 points this week that are, I think, remarkably unclear. And the lack of clarity is, of course, enhanced by the American media and the way in which they're being reported. I refer, first of all, what looks like more and more an auto coup in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and the implications of that for war in the Middle East. There's a possibility, if you like, that these Saudi Arabian machinations will develop into what at least some of the parties want very much, a war on Iran. The question is how much the United States will support Saudi Arabian war with Iran, because Saudi Arabia, for all the weapons it's bought from the United States, it was not able to go it alone, but the U.S. would be very happy indeed if Iran could be put down to a substantial degree. This is an extremely dangerous situation. It's very badly reported in this country, and an attempt to disentangle it would take certainly more time than we have here tonight, but it's something we should be paying attention to. At the same time, and in a not entirely unrelated way, the president is in Asia and has been speaking with the Chinese leadership in a way that raises the worst fears of the American political establishment. And once again, because of that, it has been remarkably badly reported what actually has gone on in Trump's trip to China. Very roughly, the indication is that the president is wants to exercise the art of the deal, his theoretical tome, with the president of China. This is extremely important, important in a way that, once again, is miserably explained by the American media. We have to go back and remember why the political establishment so hated Trump. Not because of the sorts of things we heard from the political establishment about Trump's treatment of women or his attitude towards people he should be listening to, like military figures and so forth. The reason the political establishment hated Trump was set out by the Australian commentator John Pilger before the election. Pilger wrote, "The CIA has demanded Trump is not elected president. Pentagon generals have demanded he is not elected. The pro-war New York Times, taking a breather from its relentless low-rent Putin smears, demands that he is not elected. Something is up. These tribunes," popular advocates, "these tribunes of perpetual war are terrified that the multi-billion-dollar business of war by which the United States maintains its dominance will be undermined if Trump does a deal with Putin and then with China's Xi Jinping. Their panic at the possibility of the world's great power talking peace, however unlikely, would be the blackest farce were the issues not so dire." Now, Pilcher had it exactly right, and the last year of American American discussion of foreign policy makes no sense at all unless you realize that he had it exactly right. What we've seen is an overwhelming attempt by the American political establishment, including absolutely fantastic arguments like Russiagate, to turn Trump away from his critiques of the pro-war, pro-Wall Street policies followed by the Obama-Clinton administration. They've largely succeeded. Trump was down with the program, talking war provocations around the world and supporting supporting the Wall Street economy. He was down with the program, and then he goes to China and starts to make nice with President Xi of China and begins to talk about trade and cooperation and maybe even involvement with China's major economic innovation, the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiatives, and of course the American political establishment goes nuts. This was just what we were afraid of all along. We were afraid that peace might break out in the Trump administration and the war provocations against Russia and China that had been the stock in trade of the Obama-Clinton administration wouldn't continue. Well, you know, the fox is in the hen house again. If we understand that the hens running around like chickens with their heads cut off are the academics that we heard on campus this week, the neocons saying, my God, where's our grand strategy? Where's our attack on the rest of the world? Where's our military involvement around the world? We've only got 16,000 troops in Afghanistan for 16 years, and we've got to keep that up. Let's keep going here. Everything is connected. The troops in Afghanistan are a war provocation against Russia and China. The war on terrorism is nonsensical. That's never what they were there for. And let's be very careful indeed, say the neocons, about Trump's ability to undercut our grand strategy that has existed so well through the last several administrations. Things are very dangerous, my friends. We have to pay close attention to the threat of peace breaking out in the world.
So where does one garner this understanding of what the mainstream media or the establishment figures think about Trump's trip to China and what's behind that and what it's doing? Because I mean, I just peruse the New York Times. I don't read it all that thoroughly, and I don't really look at the mainstream media, except when I'm at the gym, which I found out this morning was closing down.
Oh my goodness!
And so that's another problem I have to deal with. But what I'm looking,
you need a grand strategy here, my friend.
The New York Times or whatever. Or even watching what they're dealing with on the Real News Network, which they're dealing very seriously with Lebanon and what's happened to the leader of Lebanon and how he disappeared into Saudi Arabia. This strange business. Okay, they're talking about a lot, but we're talking about the tax reform, the Paradise Papers, which is a continuation of the Pentagon Papers.
Panama Papers.
The Pentagon Papers.
Right.
Panama Papers, and then they're talking about Russia and Facebook and all the stuff that's what I partly referred to, what is going on with Russia this and Russia that, and whether there's anything new and all this, and Donna Brazil and the Democratic Party, and then beyond that they're talking about of course the ongoing sex scandals or predatory sex scandals that are engulfing so many people, including now Roy Moore and these people. And so it's like, where is it that the average person is really going to, I mean, if the person can get beyond all this kind of headline stuff, where is anybody going to find out about what really is going on with China? Where do you go to find this stuff out? In terms of that, is it on the back section? Is it in the back sections or what?
They have to watch our program, right?
So you're not telling, is that
No,
it?
no. I mean, it's the truth is out there, as a friend of mine used to say,
But they're
quoting
not,
a television show, I
nobody's
think.
writing. I didn't see any op-ed pieces about China. I didn't see any of the New York Times columnists writing anything about Trump and China.
I think they're
did I miss something?
I think they're so stunned they don't know quite what to say. I mean, here they'd worked the U.S. populace into this notion that this crazy man is going to start a nuclear war. The psychologists talk about something called projection, which is sometimes ascribed, the notion is sometimes ascribed to Freud. I think it probably is more common than that. Projection is the attribution to your enemy, or i.e. someone else, of unacceptable thoughts and desires that the individual finds in oneself. I'm not the liar, you are. I'm not the belligerent one. You're the one who's threatening me.
Yeah.
This is a standard psychological move. What American policy has done for a long time is a matter of projection of military threats onto specifically Russia and China. It's amazing to read about Russian aggression against Europe. It's amazing to read about how China is threatening the world by its economic development. Quite serious political scientists like John Mearsheimer of Chicago talk this way. This little gang of second stringers that we heard at the University of Illinois yesterday, just take that for granted. Grand strategy of the United States is a matter of whom we're going to kill in order to make sure that these tendencies to kill people, which we attribute to our enemies, don't get spread abroad. I mean, it is literally crazy, but what it is, more importantly, is very dangerous. And that projection is what has to be, as the psychologists say, recaptured. We have to bring it back and understand where the aggression is coming from, where the belligerence is coming from, and it's coming from the United States of America. The attribution of that belligerence to China and Russia, both of whom are in very different economic and political situations from the United States, is what we should be talking about. I read a piece last week of Alfred on another show we do here by Alfred McCoy, the historian at the University of Wisconsin, about a scenario for war between the U.S. and China. That's the madness about war with Russia and China preoccupies the American political establishment right now, and therefore the American media. And it's very hard to indeed to get an honest account, a straightforward account of foreign policy in circumstances like that.
Well, they must be happy to be able to talk about sex scandals then.
Well,
they must be quite relieved, and they know that people read that stuff. They know people want all the details of it, so they're happy not to be able to deal with.
A psychologist friend of mine is
not that that's not important, if you know what I mean.
No, but has tried to make a connection here. Says it's not an accident that the revelations of this behavior of these celebrities, which it's clear is nothing all that new, should become an issue right now when there is this hysteria about American foreign policy, and particularly about the American president's foreign policy, who's been implicated in the same sort of behavior. These things, once again, in the old SDS motto, everything is connected. Harvey Weinstein and President Xi are in the same collective unconscious of the American neocons, and they're having nightmares about it.
Yeah, and I would add to that, just briefly, since we're almost done, in terms of the things that the so-called the left is willing to deal with. One of the things I had noted, a minor thing, has to do with an upcoming event sponsored by Jacobin in New York City regarding anti-Semitism. And Amy Goodman's going to host a panel of a few people, mostly Jewish, talking about anti-Semitism and the uses and abuses of anti-Semitism. And of course, that's in relation mostly to the Israel-Palestine conflict. But again, I have to say I'm not impressed, and I'm bored, and I'm not on board with the idea that that's an important issue for people in the pro-Palestine movement, which presumably these people are, to be talking about. It's not very relevant. I think it's a form of identity politics. It's a strange, convoluted form of identity politics, but it's an evasion from an understanding of what's really going on in Israel and Palestine and what needs to be done about it. And I think it's because right now, people in the pro-Palestine movement aren't really up to organizing strategically or tactically in an effective way to really challenge what's going on in Israel and Palestine in relationship to our own government.
They're up against some pretty powerful forces. Congress debated this week, in addition to federal anti-discrimination legislation, the laws on discrimination in this country, Congress had quite a serious debate this week on whether verbal attacks on Israel, that means the policy of the Israeli government, verbal attacks on Israel should be considered under the law as anti-Semitism and punishable. You may think, well, free speech. I mean, people even bad speech. No. This is part of the attempt to shut down free political speech in this country, and Congress is very seriously thinking of making an attack on a verbal attack on Israel's foreign policy to be a matter of anti-Semitism prohibited by law.
But a good ironic note to end the show on is that the person who is most identified with similar legislation in the Illinois legislature a couple years ago, which we were upset about then, Senator Ira Silverstein, has been accused of being a sexual predator in the Illinois state legislature.
Everything is connected. You've been watching News from Neptune for the 45th week of 2017, presented by Carl Estabrook and David Green, produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young and Andrew Scollery, with thanks to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson for research. No's notes are posted on the blog, newsfromneptune.com. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come, and yours and my discharge. And in the meantime, confusion to your enemies, and a good night to you. And we've added to the confusion just a bit here, perhaps, by stopping a few minutes early. Anyone got a l'envoi here?
No. Well, if I would add one footnote, I think that to the Israel-Palestine, I followed Norman Finkelstein very closely, of course.
Oh, my.
And there's a podcast. There's a podcast called The Katie Halper Show that I listened to, and she did a nice interview with him, and then she put another even more provocative interview with him behind a paywall, which you have to pay $5 to listen to. But I paid my $5 because I wanted to hear what he had to say, and I think what he has to say is as always very honestly realistic about what the movement, what's going on in Israel and Palestine, how moribund the pro-Palestine movement really is, and so that's just something that I wanted to note. He has some personal issues he's dealing with some right now as well in defending a friend of his from some legal predators, but that's another issue. You can go to his website and find out about some of those things.
And the background of this, too, in some ways, the background at least to the new situation here, is that there are very serious forces out there promoting a war and by a war I mean a shooting war, between Israel and Saudi Arabia on one hand and Iran on the other.
Right.
And it's the American permission for its primary clients, Israel and Saudi Arabia, to initiate a war which America has very much wants against Iran. That's the open question right now. Will they be willing to go that far? This is very serious indeed. Maybe the most serious foreign policy issue right now, even more serious than Asia, at least more immediately serious than the Asian situation. It's extremely dangerous and, once again, not repeated. You've been watching News from Neptune, and we will say good night.
Good night.